Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. In 2020, Operation Vulindlela launched to accelerate structural reforms and improve the country's economic performance, particularly in sectors that are critical for growth and job creation. South Africa has faced persistent economic challenges, high unemployment, sluggish growth, power shortages and infrastructure backlogs. Operation Vulindlela represented a coordinated effort to remove the structural bottlenecks holding back the economy. Phase 1 was completed last year, and despite a split opinion regarding this, the completion of this phase shows there is some trajectory on the right track. Joining me now to discuss Phase 2 and the projects for it, I'd like to welcome Aalia Cassim. She's the Acting Chief Director for Microeconomic Policy at National Treasury. Aalia, salams. Thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV.
Walaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Aalia, how would you sum up Phase 1 in terms of making sure the stability of South Africa that it is seeking has been achieved?
So the first phase was conceptualized to deal with a number of particular constraints on the economy. We were in the thick of load shedding. There was a freight and logistics crisis. There were a number of challenges in water distribution, as well as issues in terms of skilled migration. And today, where we're at, and probably last year, we've sort of seen load shedding abate to a large extent, which is a significant step forward. There's also a clear pathway in terms of reform for the logistics sector to allow private sector participation in. There are also reforms tabled for bulk water resource management and governance of water services. A visa review has been implemented, which aims to attract highly skilled individuals. And while a number of reforms are still underway, there is a large investment pipeline that's been unlocked. I think last year the estimate was around 500 billion rand. And we've also seen SOEs being repositioned. So sort of as confidence builds, investment follows, one generates employment and stimulates demand, and there's sort of a virtuous cycle that leads to higher economic growth. And what's also notable is that the GNU may disagree on a number of issues, but the reform agenda is not one of them, which means there is political backing for these types of changes.
Aalia, I want to just, with the energy perspective, I mean, how key was this acquisition of 600 megawatts of new capacity? And I mean, this year also included 22,500 megawatts of projects with over 10,000 megawatts. I mean, the proof is in the pudding when you look at, for example, the fact that we really don't have load shedding the way we saw it as probably as early as last year, right before the national elections.
Yes, and it wasn't election related. It was a sustained effort to reduce, to bring in the private sector to contribute to the grid, as well as ramp up maintenance for Eskom. I suppose the electricity supply shortfall was really because of the declining performance of aging coal-fired power stations, as well as a lag in generation capacity or developing new generation capacity. So the regulatory reforms that were made in August 2021, which enabled private sector electricity generation for the first time, and then the subsequent lifting and removal of that license, were really important in terms of developing this pipeline, which is sort of estimated at around 390 billion rand. And that has supported growth through the number of crises that we faced over the past 5 years. Approximately 1,300 megawatts of these projects have been connected to the grid.
You can carry on, Aalia. Yeah.
Okay. And I suppose this pipeline has directly contributed to the reduction of load shedding. It also shifts South Africa's transition to a low-cost, low-carbon energy, and it's also vital in terms of global signals around the competitiveness of our exports.
Aalia, the auction of new spectrum, I mean, this has been fraught with so many delays. I think a lot of individuals were asking, I mean, when are we going to get this auctioning happening? And here we are, it has been achieved. And the importance of it finally happening within phase one?
So South Africa has historically struggled with higher data costs and subpar quality if you compare us to peer economies. And the spectrum auction allowed us to allocate high demand spectrum, which allows signals to cover longer distances and reduces the need for transmission, for the number of transmission towers and base stations. And so the primary objective of this auction was to lower the cost of mobile broadband. I think the cost of a 1.5 gigabyte data bundle decreased by 40%, expand network coverage and enhance network quality. And you actually see that if you look at some of these metrics. It also simultaneously generated around 14 billion rand for the state.
Aalia, the logistics sector itself has suffered for the last decade. We've seen that, of course, especially when it comes to Transnet. Do you believe via phase one, especially with regards to that very same SOE that I've mentioned, and the private sector involvement, that we are back on track in terms of this?
So, I do believe we're back on track. I think phase one laid the groundwork to restructure Transnet and increase private sector participation. The freight logistics roadmap that was approved by Cabinet in December 2023 was critical here. In terms of restoring efficiency and competitiveness of the sector, but also implementing some of the operational improvements that need to happen immediately to arrest the decline on rail. And we've sort of seen Transnet's rail volumes increase to 160 million tons in 2024-25, which is an improvement on the previous financial year. A network statement was launched in December 2024, and that sort of sets out the operating rights for train operating companies that want to take up slots on the rail network. There's also a private sector participation unit that's been established at the DBSA, and they launched an RFI, which is basically a request for information to the market to gauge interest in private sector participation on the rail network, and the response was really encouraging. And substantial in terms of what the department expected. So I do think we've set ourselves up, and it's really just about implementing some of these reforms and seeing through private sector access on the rail network.
Aalia, last week in the Mail and Guardian, economist Ntokozo Buthelezi had mentioned, and I'm going to quote this here, there's no real accountability mechanism with regards to Operation Vulindlela. He goes on to say there's mentions of billions here, billions there, but no real pathway in terms of that. I just wanted to get your response to those comments, especially when there is mention with regards to accountability.
So I would have to disagree with that. And I think it's important to look at a range of voices, but also look at what's publicly available. So when Operation Vulindlela was set up, it was because business as usual was not working. And there were numerous implementation challenges in government. And the OV, as we call it, the delivery methodology, and this type of methodology has been used in a number of countries, is set on measurable objectives, tracking progress through data analysis, intervening where reforms are off track. And the team is responsible. So while the team does this sort of tracking and provides information to guide decision making, it's not responsible for implementation of these reforms. And that's really the job of ministers and director generals of line departments. So the team has quarterly stock takes with the departments to assess reform progress, and the reforms are sort of built into the APPs for departments. But to reinforce this accountability of the team, the OV unit reports directly to the president, and progress reports are submitted to the Minister of Finance, the deputy ministers, the economic cluster, and cabinet committees. And these reports are actually publicly available to ensure transparency and accountability. And prior to this, I don't think this type of reporting was actually available in government. At the moment, the team is currently developing detailed reform implementation plans in collaboration with departments, each with specific reform actions and time frames. And obviously, we've learned from the previous phase in terms of resources required, sort of methodologies where we can improve. But I certainly think there is a lot of evidence available to show progress.
After the break, we continue this conversation. We're going to be shifting to spatial inequality, and I think that has been a massive talking point, especially given the historical context with regards to apartheid and how the second phase of Operation Vulindlela aims to try and go ahead and correct that. My conversation with Aalia Cassim continues after the break. Welcome back to Talking Point. Now, of course, when it comes to spatial inequality, this has been a big discussion point. Many would have assumed that at 1994, of course, when the start of the democratic South Africa, we would have had sorted the housing issue. That hasn't happened, and of course, a slow phase with regards to that. But phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela aims to go ahead and make sure that that is all changed. Aalia, again, shukran so much for staying with us. I want to talk about the progress report for the first quarter of the 2025-26 financial year. Spatial planning remains a major hurdle. This phase of Operation Vulindlela, how does it aim to go ahead and solve that?
So part of this phase is, and this particular reform on spatial inequality is about creating dynamic and integrated cities that enables economic activity and really deals with the legacies of apartheid spatial planning, focusing on passenger rail and housing. I think, and many of these issues are as a result of urban sprawl. We are seeing the poorest of the poor having to spend a quarter or up to 40% of their income on public transport, which is sort of unacceptable. So one of the immediate priorities is to complete the recovery of Pras's passenger rail network across the country to enable people to travel from outlying areas into city centers. And we've seen this in Joburg and Cape Town, as well as eThekwini, and a number of other places. So 35 or 40 lines have sort of come online, and a number were out for many, many years. In terms of metro rail stations, 313 of 468 have been refurbished and reopened, which is significant progress, and that was over a short period of time. In terms of the housing priorities, the focus is really on releasing public land for social housing, and then redirecting RDP funding towards demand-side subsidies. So RDP is sort of supply side from government, but a demand-side subsidy allows people to live where they want to. And you can also access housing that supports densification in cities. The other big reform is around clearing the backlog of title deeds and making the titling system more accessible and affordable. The current backlog is 1 million title deeds, which is significant. And it has huge implications for people that don't have title deeds.
Aalia, let's obviously talk about the structure of the country cities. And this is something President Cyril Ramaphosa had spoken about. He emphasized that the structure of the cities has to change to enable people to access work. And you've mentioned it quite well, the poorest of the poor are paying high transport costs to go ahead and make trips, whether it's from the townships to the urban areas. And I know that it's not just the public sector that needs to come to the party. It's also the private sector that needs to also step up and assist with regards to that. And I want to talk about that importance that both sectors, public and private, and what they have to do to try and make sure that this happens. Because I know obviously a lot of the blame goes into government, but obviously in that they can't be the only ones trying to go ahead and solve this issue. So the importance of the private sector also coming to the party here.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Both the public and private sector have a critical role to play in delivering housing and shaping cities. OV has worked closely with the private sector across reforms to mobilize resources, provide technical assistance, to diagnose the challenge, because often you're dealing with property developers, so that we can sort of see where the issues are and then accelerate delivery. In terms of the spatial reforms in particular, the private sector is responsible for delivering most of South Africa's housing stock. So there is a large role to play, even in social housing. There's also a role to play in terms of leveraging blended finance for infrastructure projects, given the fiscal constraints on the state. And I think that that's something that we're trying to leverage across the reforms.
Aalia, the mentioning of titling systems, again, President Ramaphosa has spoken about that, and it's a potential to go ahead and turn houses into assets for poor households. How will this be used to advance these low-income earning citizens of South Africa? I mean, the title deeds itself will be quite a major boost, but how will this really enhance, especially the low-income earning citizens of South Africa, which we have quite a lot of within this country, if of course look at the latest stats in terms of the employment?
Yes, sure. Housing could be one of the most significant assets on the balance sheet of a poor household, if you think about it like that. But if you don't have a title deed, then the value of the asset is sort of constrained, as there's no proof of ownership. And it also limits the financial opportunities that a person has, because it limits the ability of lenders to provide mortgage finance on some of these properties. It also means that buyers need to find cash to finance a purchase, which over time constrains the property price growth, and ability in terms of what is available to that person. And beyond this, I suppose households that have purchased properties informally can't rely on the courts to enforce their property rights in the case of encroachment or if they are at risk of eviction. So clearing this backlog is certainly a priority, and systems are currently being developed to make this possible.
Aalia, I want to follow up to that question because I mean you mentioned the buying of houses informally, and I'll agree with you on that it does make it very difficult for the courts to say, well, look here, I mean, you've done this not in a formal way, and that informality has made it very difficult for us to go ahead and assist you in trying to make sure that the house is on your name. And I want to touch on the formality that this needs to be done in order to make sure that when, of course, they do approach courts, they have quite a strong case behind them.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And I suppose it's all about protecting your property rights as an owner. So if you have this in a government system that's been digitized, then that's your evidence base that when you do have to go to a court, if in the case you do, that you can use to back up your case. So I think that's critically important to secure property rights of poorer people, such that they can use this as an asset for various other needs.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Aalia Cassim. We're going to be touching on strengthening local government. Of course, next year, the local government elections is taking place. And if you read the AG's report, 41 clean audits out of 275 municipalities. Now, of course, this is a major improvement to what we have seen in the past financial years, where really many municipalities were being painted with a bleak picture, I beg your pardon, in terms of how it was being run. Of course, a lot of it coming down to corrupt municipal officials that are operating within there. How does Operation Vulindlela now assist within trying to make sure that local government is strengthened at its core? The conversation continues after this break. Welcome back to Talking Point. As important as the national and provincial elections are, the local government elections has just the same equal ability to it. Of course, it assists in how you, as a resident of a municipality or metro, sees your government being operated. How does Operation Vulindlela assist with regards to making sure your local government, whether it's your metro or municipality, has the right amount of, number one, resources, but also accountability mechanisms to that? I'm still in conversation with Aalia Cassim, who is the Acting Chief Director of Microeconomic Policy at National Treasury. Aalia, President Ramaphosa had insisted that many municipalities can't deliver basic services to its communities. We've seen that. I mean, we've seen many news reports. We've seen eyewitness accounts on the ground, and it's frustrating given that these services cannot be delivered as enshrined in our constitution. How important is it for phase two to make sure that we are not going back, but we have a sense of moving forward, especially when it comes to this?
So this is critically important. I think phase one focused on some of the necessary conditions for growth, but they weren't sufficient. And there were these emerging constraints and sort of long-standing constraints, if you think about municipalities, as well as spatial inequality, that needed to be dealt with. So phase one spent a lot of time on national policy and regulatory frameworks in water and electricity. But if electricity distribution or water reticulation infrastructure at local levels is not adequate or up to scratch, then the other policies basically have limited impact. So load shedding has largely abated, but there are still municipal outages often. And water provision is already at crisis levels. So it's really critical to get these delivery of basic services right. And more generally, service delivery is important in terms of social stability, in terms of political stability, in terms of lowering the cost and ease of doing business, in terms of household welfare and well-being, and also there's a big impact in terms of the macro variables, in terms of investor confidence, in terms of housing developments. So it's really critical to get these basic services to communities, as well as into cities, and have them adequately functioning, if we want to, push the economy to new limits.
Yeah, I want to do a follow-up to that, Aalia. City Power just the other day were mentioning that, look, I mean, there's only so much that they can do in trying to make sure that they can curb illegal connections. There have been a number of illegal connections that are happening within the city of Johannesburg. And I think that's an important part of what Operation Vulindlela Phase Two is trying to do, isn't it, Aalia? To try and make sure that these sort of operations in terms of illegal connections are a thing of the past. And again, to the defense of City Power, there's only so much that they can try and do to make sure the entire Johannesburg, which is quite a large metropolis, is catered for in terms of power.
So I think there's a security element there in terms of illegal connections. But there's also a systems issue. If you have adequate meters and monitoring, smart meters and those type of monitoring systems, that allows the city to collect revenue from those that are using electricity and then use that to invest back in its infrastructure. And one of the big reforms that National Treasury under the City Support Program is looking at is called the Trading Services Reform. And we're doing this with the World Bank. And this is really about taking electricity or water revenue, ring fencing it, and then investing it back into infrastructure. And a lot of this revenue at the moment is cross-subsidizing other services that municipalities provide. So you're not getting the adequate maintenance of infrastructure, and you're not getting the reforms around the billing, metering services that are necessary to have a fully functioning system. So that's an important reform. That's one way of looking at how you invest back into infrastructure, which is so important at the moment, and making sure that what is used is paid for.
Aalia, I'm sure you also keep an eye on the Auditor General's reports when she's, of course, in Parliament, and there's a lot of frustration when, of course, she's delivering it. And I'm going to go as far back as probably before the pandemic had hit in. A lot of the reports, a lot of the audits were not coming out as positive as we would have liked to have been. I mean, as little as single digits of municipalities were only recording clean audits. Now, the latest report, which is one could look at it as a half glass full scenario, 41 clean audits out of 275 municipalities. And this is going back 4 years, still at the height of the pandemic. How important is phase two going to be to try and assist not only the Auditor General, but these municipalities which had audits which were not as positive as they would have liked it to have been?
So municipalities in South Africa, obviously this is a very worrying statistic. Municipalities in South Africa have a broad range of responsibilities. And I think if you compare municipalities to by international standards, you wouldn't find a municipality, even in developing countries, having the number of responsibilities and mandates that South African municipalities do. And in reality, very few, which is clearly evidenced by these numbers, are equipped to deal with these challenges. And this has resulted in a huge operational and financial crisis that is affecting service delivery. And many of them are indebted to Eskom as well as water boards. And that's a direct threat to the viability of these entities. And obviously, the state has put a lot of money into Eskom. So the risk is really also on the fiscus. So one of the key reforms for Operation Vulindlela in this phase is to professionalize municipalities and ensure that municipal managers and CFOs actually meet the minimum standards of qualifications, experience, and integrity, and also extend the mandate of the Public Service Commission, which is sort of an independent oversight body, to look at compliance at local government level. And there isn't this kind of compliance body at local government level. Whether these reforms are, I mean, obviously you are navigating a very complex political economy and socioeconomic context in a number of these metros and municipalities. So it is difficult to navigate. But the reform I mentioned earlier around trading services is also hugely important here in terms of making sure financial arrangements are adequate to deal with, to improve, so that you can actually see clean audits.
Yeah, and of course, a PSC chairperson, Professor Somadoda Fikeni, when I spoke to him at the State of the Nation, he had mentioned that governance also is going to be quite key with regards to this, and how the GNU shapes itself will, of course, be some sort of a blueprint to how the metros and the municipalities are going to be in terms of a governance perspective. Aalia, I want to touch on cooperative governance and traditional affairs. They issued an update on white paper on local government along with the current proceedings on this document. How important is it to make sure that the fight on corruption within these municipalities is made a priority? I ask this because we have seen many municipalities where malfeasance has risen, and it's affected the most vulnerable, especially in communities where still till today basic services has become such a mission. This tackling on corruption, how important is phase two going to be to try and make sure that not only accountability is given, but also post that the delivery is maintained on a consistent basis for the residents of these respective communities?
So anti-corruption measures are key so that funds paid for services can be channeled back into service delivery, maintenance, what they're meant for. And obviously this is currently not the case. Some of this is corruption and blatant diversion of revenue. But the other part is also very complicated financial arrangements that allow cross-subsidization. So you will see, for a long time, electricity revenue, and I think in some cases now there's less electricity revenue because a number of people have moved, or a number of households have moved to use solar. You see electricity revenue being used for a number of other, to cross-subsidize a number of other services. There are also complicated lending arrangements between the cities and their agencies. So the review of the white paper, I think, it's not always considered how complicated some of these reforms are. These are arrangements that have been in place for a long time. And how do you actually think of some of these institutional arrangements? So the white paper review is actually critical to ensure appropriate and effective governance. The institutional arrangements are correct. You have sometimes a dual mandate for different parts of metros and districts and provinces. So you need to make sure that the mandate is very clear and the responsibilities are very clear for each of those agencies and entities. And that would ensure better service delivery and better maintenance of infrastructure and more transparent financial arrangements is critical to create some accountability when there's clear roles and responsibilities. So, it's often that government is reviewing a paper or putting together another task team, but these are such complicated arrangements, and it's after such a long time where things are clearly not working, it's very useful to reflect back on how these systems can be designed effectively and how municipalities can be equipped to better do their jobs with professionalizing the service, with making sure that funding is more targeted and with less complicated financial arrangements so utilities can run more effectively.
Aalia, we've just got 1 minute and I want to follow up with regards to that, the point that you mentioned on cross subsidization. I mean, the last thing I think any municipality wants is to try and make sure that what money was used for one department is then used for another. I mean, there's two sides to it, of course. One side is trying to create a balanced budget, but the other one is, of course, bad accounting practices. I think the most important aspect of this is that monies that are put in for certain departments are used for those departments, and that you don't have to have a situation where you're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. I mean, that's probably not what the municipalities would want. And I would like to assume that Phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela will assist the municipalities in that.
Yeah, so part of the Phase 2 reforms is also what the National Treasury is doing on grants. So there's a conditional grant review that's currently underway. There's and then there's a broader municipal fiscal framework review that will look at some of these funding arrangements and how you can avoid some of the cross-subsidization. And those findings will also feed into the white paper. So it's sort of a broad, across-government approach, which is useful when looking at such complex issues.
After the break, I wrap up my conversation with Aalia Cassim. Are we going to be touching on digital transformation? And of course, what more we can expect from Phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela. Do stay tuned. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're wrapping up this conversation, looking ahead to the start. Of course, it has already begun, I beg your pardon. That is Operation Vulindlela Phase 2. Aalia, digital transformation, I think, has been a huge talking point also. Just this morning I was listening to a radio show and a caller had said that where is South Africa in terms of that? Are we really that behind? And then, of course, preparing for this interview, I realized that, of course, you've got Operation Vulindlela that has really specifics in trying to make sure that there is a pure transformation roadmap for digital transformation. Why is it necessary for this to be achieved, given that many developing nations are moving at a rapid pace in terms of the digital space?
So it's exactly that. I think we've seen incredible impact of digital public infrastructure in peer countries like Brazil and India and Kenya. And the digital so just in terms of what was done, a digital ID sort of reduces fraud in the disbursement of social protection payments. So there's health and social benefits there. Then you have digital payments, which reduce the cost of transactions and enable the use of safe digital money in the informal sector, and also increase financial inclusion for informal traders. And then there are also these government-wide exchanges, which enable policymakers to have a better view of their citizens and their changing needs and expectations, while reducing the administrative burden on both officials and citizens. So the digital public infrastructure initiative is not divergent where many developing countries are moving in terms of the digital space, but it's sort of building on the strides of other countries, and people have done study tours in terms of trying to understand what's worked and what hasn't. OV Phase Two aims to build a sort of a centralized zero-rated platform called MyMzansi, and that'll enable South Africans to get remote access to critical services like from Home Affairs, from SASSA, the Department of Education, and that's all covered in the first phase of the digital transformation roadmap.
Aalia, South Africans, naturally, we are very impatient. We want to see things being done now, and it must be done at a quick pace. Of course, in the perfect world, that would have been the case, but we're not living in the perfect world, unfortunately. Given the time period that government has set itself in achieving these targets, can it be achieved in the period that, of course, government has looked at and said, listen, when we look at Operation Vulindlela Phase Two, there's something that we can work towards in terms of a time period?
So the time period is quite ambitious, but I think we believe that it can be achieved during that period. There's a huge amount of people who are working towards this. The first phase will be from 2025 to 2027, and that's focused on connecting social media protection services with employment outcomes. And then the second phase is 2027 to 2030, and that's about connecting services in education, business services, and healthcare. So broadly, the roadmap aims to launch the MyMzansi platform in early 2026, which is very soon, with a set of priority services. And then the functional digital ID is scheduled to be launched in mid-2026, with digital payments from mid-2028, and then full implementation of the data exchange expected by the end of 2029. So I think, we certainly think this is doable and have put a huge amount of resources behind it.
Aalia, at the start of this year, at the World Economic Forum, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said that South Africa can target a 1% GDP growth this year. I think we'd all like to see that happening, but there are factors outside, like, for example, geopolitics, the micro and macroeconomic aspects, and, of course, global inflation. With Operation Vulindlela Phase Two, can we at least get close to this 1% GDP growth that was set out at the start of this year?
So the forecast in the May budget overview, which is the final budget, was actually 1.4% for 2025. And that was revised down from the previous budgets that were not tabled this year, but that were that the minister announced. Because of the numerous domestic and global risks. So currently there are more downside than upside risks. And I suppose South Africa, as a small open economy, is dependent on global trade and financial inflows, and at the moment exposed to external volatility. So if we see rapid intensification of some of the trade tensions, as well as elevated policy uncertainty, it's certainly going to weigh on that forecast. And the forecast will be presented again by the Treasury in the medium-term budget in October. But in spite of this, there is the investment in renewable energy, as well as improved sentiment around reform progress. We certainly have seen a fair amount of progress in the visa space and the transport space. Those are likely to support growth through improved investor confidence over the medium term, and hopefully that translates into actual investment over the medium term.
Yeah, and of course there is that 30% tariff hikes by US President Donald Trump. It's going to make things slightly difficult. But obviously, after the medium-term policy budget statement, it is going to be G20. According to Donald Trump, he's not going to be attending it. But I guess we all know the character of Donald Trump. He may just change his mind overnight. South Africa, of course, hosts the G20 this year, Aalia. And with the scale of this event, is there added pressure for Phase Two to become even more successful?
So I think there is certainly a spotlight on South Africa at the moment. For the G20 is one big reason, but there have been a number of other reasons why South Africa is in the global spotlight. I think there's always been pressure on Operation Vulindlela. I suppose it was formalized in the middle of a load shedding crisis. and it's been set up to deal with subsequent big structural constraints when business as usual was insufficient to move the needle on growth. So I think the pressure comes from the low levels of growth that we've seen, poor sentiment, high levels of unemployment, slow progress on the first phase of reforms. So the pressure is almost consistent to see these changes in investment growth and broader well-being. I think we've set ourselves up well in terms of the policy and regulatory frameworks in the first phase to actually move towards implementation that hopefully leads to more investment over the medium and longer term.
Aalia, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
No, absolute pleasure. That's Aalia Cassim, the Acting Chief Director for Microeconomic Policy at the National Treasury. That's all we have for you here on Talking Point. If you've missed today's episode, it will be available on our YouTube channel, Hilaal TV. That's all we have for you here from myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.